Hi, my name is Michelle, the designer and maker behind Fortive, and today I'm going to be sharing with you how to sew my first ever PDF pattern, the Tulip Top. The Tulip Top is available in sizes extra small to 6XL and comes in 2 different fit versions depending on your bust size. When I made this design, I was inspired by corsets and wanted a design that was fitted at the bust but still allowed some movement at the waist. The Tulip-like hem is as cute as it is comfy, providing some extra room for movement at the waist. And the lace-up sides allow you to easily adjust the top, whether you're layering garments underneath or you're fluctuating in size. You can make your tulip top with either grommets or loops at the side, and for this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to install grommets. I'm so excited to be sharing this design with you to sew yourself. It's such a fun make and has some very satisfying parts in the construction that I hope you'll enjoy as much as I do. If you don't already have the tulip top pattern, I'll link it in the description below. Now let's begin making the tulip top. If you're printing the tulip top pattern at home, you'll start by cutting along the bottom and right side of each paper and taping them together. The pattern is laid out in 5 columns and 3 rows, and for all sizes, page 11 isn't needed. Once you've taped your pattern together, you can go ahead and cut out your pattern pieces. You should have 6 pieces total. Now it's time to cut out the main fabric, the lining fabric, and the interfacing. For this style, I recommend choosing a mid to heavyweight fabric for the main and a lightweight lining. In this tutorial, I'll be using a midweight denim and lining it with a lightweight cotton. Once all of your pieces are cut out, we're going to interface the sides of both the side front and the side back pieces. Since we're using a fusible interfacing, make sure to place the glue side down onto the wrong side of the fabric and press and hold the iron down for about 10 seconds to make sure that the interfacing is properly adhered. Once the side front and side back pieces are interfaced, take the center front and side backs and place the main and lining fabric's right sides together. The first step in sewing the tulip top is to fully construct the side backs and center front, including the top stitching. First, we're going to pin the center front, and starting and stopping at the corners, sew along the neckline with a 1 cm seam allowance. Note that all the seam allowance for the tulip top is 1 cm. Once we've sewn the neckline, we'll sew the curved hem, starting 1 cm up from the notch. From there, we'll sew on an angle to the point where the seam allowance meets the notch. Then we'll pivot and sew all around the curve of the hem. Remove pins as you go and slowly make your way around the hem. When you reach the other side, you're going to do the same thing as when you started, pivoting at the notch point and sewing at an angle to 1 cm above the notch. Next, we'll pin one side back together, matching the notches. We'll start sewing above the notch at the inside hem. The starting point is where the seam allowance meets the raw edge when it's continued past the notch. Once we've backstitched, we're going to sew around the curve of the hem and continue up the side, removing pins as we go. In the written instructions, the center front is trimmed before moving on to the side backs. But you're also welcome to do it this way, where you sew both the center front and the side backs first before we do the trimming for both. After we sew up the side, we're going to pivot at the corner and sew the top all the way to the raw edge, backstitching at the end. Next, we're going to trim both the center front and side backs, trimming around the hem and clipping into the corners and curves. For the side backs, we'll start by clipping a triangle out of the corner 2 mm away from the stitch line, making sure not to cut through the stitches. Next, if you're using pinking shears, you'll trim all around the curve of the hem, making sure the top edge of the seam allowance is only trimmed down to 7 mm. Note that the seam allowance is trimmed to 7 mm along the hem and princess seams to reduce bulk but still leave enough seam allowance to catch the top stitching. I find this helps to give this top a sturdier feel, especially along the curved hem. If you don't have pinking shears, you can use your fabric scissors to cut small triangles out along the curve of the hem about 7 mm apart, stopping 2 mm from the stitch line. Once you've cut all of your triangles, you can trim the seam allowance down to 7 mm. Once we've trimmed the side backs, we'll move on to the center front, starting by clipping both corners of the hem and along the curve of the neckline, stopping 2 mm from the stitch line. After we've clipped along the neckline, we'll use either the pinking shears or fabric scissors to trim around the hem, starting and stopping at the clipped corners. For this one, I'll be using the pinking shears. Next, you'll flip the center front and side backs right side out and iron them along the sewn edge. As you iron, I recommend rolling the outer fabric slightly towards the inside, only by about 1 mm, to ensure the lining doesn't show when the tulip top's worn. To do this, I actually recommend working in small sections, rolling the edge as you iron. As you can see, there's only about 1 mm of the main fabric showing on the inner edge. We'll continue ironing along the curved hem in the same way, slightly rolling the outer fabric towards the inside. Once we've ironed all of the edges of the center front and side backs, I recommend easing the lining onto the main fabric so it lays flatter. To do this, iron the edges inward, moving around the piece, then iron the piece as a whole. I find using steam helps to slightly shrink the lining onto the main fabric as well. Now we're going to top stitch the center front and side backs. To start, switch your upper thread to whichever top stitching thread you'll be using. For this tutorial, I'll be using my regular sewing thread. For the bobbin, I recommend matching it to the lining color. We'll start by top stitching the neckline, starting and stopping at the raw edges. For the tulip top, all the top stitching is 6 mm away from the finished edge, or 1/4 inch. I recommend sewing the top stitching with the right sides facing up, that way you can see the view as it'll be worn, ensuring the edges are rolled over slightly towards the back as you sew. When you begin top stitching, check the tension to make sure that the top stitching thread is not showing at the back and the bobbin thread is not pulling to the front. You may have to adjust your tension before you begin. If there's a small amount of lining offset on the raw edges, you can trim it off as well as the edge of the seam allowance on the neckline. Next, we're going to top stitch around the center front hem, starting where the top stitching line meets the raw edge when it's continued past the notch. This is done to ensure a smooth transition into the front side panel once it's attached. Top stitch around the curve of the hem, continuing past the notch in a smooth line until you reach the raw edge on the other side. Next, we'll top stitch the side backs, starting at the raw edge and top stitching around the hem, up the side and across the top. Since we're top stitching the right sides facing up, you'll have to start from the other end when top stitching the other side back. Next, we're going to switch to a basting stitch and sew close to the edge the open sides of the center front and side backs. This will prevent shifting when attaching to the other panels. Before we attach the side fronts to the center front, I recommend ironing the side backs and center front once again to smooth out the lining after top stitching. Next, we're going to attach the side fronts to the center front. There's approximately 1 centimeter or 3/4 of an inch in between the top two notches on the side front. To help ease this onto the center front, we're going to baste and lightly gather in between these notches. If you're comfortable easing without basting, you're welcome to skip this step. For those of you who'd like to ease with basting, we'll be basting 2 rows in between the upper and middle notch, one 6 millimeters away from the edge and the other 12 millimeters away. I recommend starting a little bit above the notch and basting the row that's nearest to the edge first. When you get to the middle notch, you can pivot, sew a couple stitches, then pivot again, and baste back up to where you started. This way you're sewing the second row of basting in one go, so you don't have to tie off one of the ends. When you're done basting, you're going to repeat this on the other side front and both of the side front lining pieces. Next, you're going to ease the side front onto the center front, matching the notches and easing in between them. We want the middle notch on the side front to match the notch on the center front, and the upper notch on the side front to match the top edge of the center front. To ease the side front, we'll take both ends of the top basting threads and gently pull them as we distribute the ease, laying the side front against the center front and easing it until the notches match. Note that the top edge of the center front should be in line with the upper side front notch along the raw edge. Once you've eased the side front enough, tie the top threads together and the bottom threads together to ensure the easing doesn't loosen. Repeat this step for the other side front and both side front linings. Make sure the easing is evenly distributed and there are no puckers. If you'd like, you can gently steam this area with your iron to slightly shrink the easing down. Once we've eased all the side fronts, we're going to take the left side front and the center front and place them right sides together, matching the notches and pinning in place. The lower notch on the side front should be in line with the hem edge of the center front along the seam allowance. As previously shown, the upper corner of the center front is in line with the upper side back notch along the raw edge. Once we've pinned the side front to the center front, we're going to sew this seam with the 1 centimeter seam allowance. I recommend sewing with the side front on the bottom as the feed dogs help ease the upper section onto the center front. As you sew the upper section, I recommend checking the easing as you go to make sure there are no puckers. Next, you're going to pin the side front lining to the center front and side front, right sides facing each other. This step is comparable to the burrito method, as we'll be encasing the center front in between the side front and side front lining, sewing them together. When we sew around the side front, we're going to leave a space of about 13 centimeters or 5 inches, starting a little under the middle notch. I recommend sewing with the main side front facing up, as you can more easily follow your previous stitch line. When you get to the middle notch, we'll sew about 3 centimeters past it before backstitching and leaving the space. About 13 centimeters down, we'll start sewing again just before the lower notch. When you get to the lower notch, we'll pivot and continue along the hem, making sure not to catch the center front as we sew. You can choose to pin all around the side front before sewing, but I prefer to pin in sections as I go, first pinning and sewing the bust seam, then the hem and side, and lastly the strap. I prefer this because it allows you to adjust the layers as you sew, leaving an open space to move the center front out of the way. When we get to the underarm, we'll pivot at the corner and sew up the strap all the way to the raw edge. When placing the pins along the strap, make sure the side front and side front lining are laying flat. This is more important than matching the raw edges, so if your pieces are slightly offset, that's okay. You can just use the main side front as the guideline for your seam allowance. Before removing the basting along the bust seam, check to make sure the second stitch line matches the previous one. Next, we're going to trim the side front, first snipping a triangle out of the corner 2 millimeters away from the stitch line. Next, we'll trim the bust seam down to 7 millimeters to reduce bulk. We can leave the neckline untrimmed. After that, we'll trim the hemline using either fabric scissors or pinking shears, just like how we trim the side back and center front hems. Next, we'll snip into a few spots along the armhole where it's curved, stopping 2 millimeters away from the stitch line. This will help it to lay flat when we turn the top right sides out. Once we've trimmed the side front, we can now pull out the center front and turn the side front right sides out through the opening along the bust seam. This part is so satisfying. Once you've pulled out the side front, I recommend pushing the seams towards the lining with your hand through the opening at the bust seam. This helps when ironing and rolling the edges slightly towards the lining. Next, we'll go ahead and attach the right side front to the center front, first pinning in place and matching the notches, just like we did for the left side. Next, we'll pin the side front lining to the center front and side front, sewing them together like we did the first side, but instead we'll be starting below the middle notch and sewing up the strap. This is so that we can keep the main fabric facing up to follow the previous stitch line and help in easing the lining onto the center front. When sewing around the rest of the side front, I recommend facing the lining side up so you can start from the bust seam and work your way around the strap, just like we did in the previous side. As you sew around the side front, you'll now be encasing both the center front and the right side front. If it's quite bulky and feeling tricky to sew, you can pull out part of the bulk from the opening in the bust seam before continuing around the side front, or you can wait to encase the entire piece until you reach the strap like I'm doing here. Just like when we sewed the right side front, we want to make sure the lining and main fabric are laying flat before pinning in place and sewing. It's okay if the edges are offset as long as they lay flat. Now that we've sewed the right side front, I went ahead and trimmed around the hem, along the bust seam, clipped the corner, and snipped into the curve of the armhole. Once you've done the same, we can pull everything out from the opening at the bust seam. Once we've turned the front right side out, we'll iron all around both side fronts, rolling the edges slightly towards the lining as we go. When ironing the bust seam, I recommend using a tailor's ham if you have one, as it allows to more easily iron the curve of the bust. To make it easier to hand stitch clothes later, we'll also iron the seam allowance along the opening. Once you've ironed the bust seam from the lining side, iron the bust seam from the front as well. This will ensure a flat seam when we top stitch later on. Now that we've finished constructing the front, we'll move on to the back, first starting by attaching the side backs to the center back. With right sides facing each other, pin the side backs to the center back, matching the notches. The lower notch on the center back should be in line with the side back hemline along the seam line. Next, we'll sew the side backs to the center back, removing pins as we go. Once we've sewn both side backs to the center back, we'll take our center back lining and place it right sides together on top of the center back, matching the notches and pinning in place. Just like when we sewed the side front, it's more important to have the center backs laying flat against each other than having the edges match, so it's okay if they're a little bit offset. We'll sew with the main fabric facing up so we can see our previous stitch line, and we'll start sewing at the outer edge of the strap 1 centimeter below the top edge. Similar to the front, we'll be encasing the side back panels as we sew around the center back. When we get to the first seam, we'll leave about a 13 centimeter space below the first notch so we can turn the back right sides out later on. Once we've sewn all around the outer edge of the center back, we'll backstitch 1 centimeter before the top edge of the strap, just like when we started on the other side. Next, we'll sew around the neckline, starting and stopping 1 centimeter away from the top edge, just like the outer edges. Next, we'll trim the center back, first cutting a triangle out of either corner 2 millimeters away from the sewing line. Then we'll trim down the seams to 7 millimeters. Next, we'll snip into the curve of the neckline 2 millimeters from the sewing line. Then we'll trim the hemline using either our pinking shears or fabric scissors. Once the center back is trimmed, we're now ready to attach the front straps through the opening in the center back. I recommend using a loop turner for this step, as it allows you to easily grab the front strap through the back strap and pull it through. We'll start by facing both the front and back lining sides up. Then we'll feed one front strap through the opening on the center back, making sure it doesn't twist on the way up. Next, we'll take the loop turner and insert it in the top opening of the back strap, catching a spot near the top edge of the front strap and gently pulling it through. You can help guide the strap from the outside with your other hand. Once we've pulled the strap through, we'll make sure the top edges match and the front strap edges are right against the edges of the back strap. Next, we'll sew across the strap, starting and stopping 1 centimeter in from the edge. This will create a corner with the previous stitch line. Once you've sewn the strap, you can repeat these steps for the other front strap. Next, we'll trim the corners, starting by snipping them on an angle 2 millimeters away from the stitch line. Then we'll trim the top seam down to 0.5 centimeters and trim some excess off the sides too. Next, we'll flip the back right sides out through the opening along the center back. As you can see, our straps are now clean finished. Next, we'll go ahead and iron the back just like we did the front, slightly rolling the edges towards the lining as we iron. We'll also press in the seam allowance along the open seam. Once the back is ironed, we're going to hand sew the open seam closed on both sides of the front and one side at the back. We'll start by threading a hand sewing needle and knotting the end. Then we'll go from the inside of the opening and pull the needle through right along the stitch line. Next, we'll sew with an invisible stitch, first stitching into the folded edge and then just in front of the stitch line, repeating these 2 stitches until we've closed the opening. When sewing in front of the stitch line, make sure you're only catching the lining so it doesn't show through the front. Once you've finished sewing this opening, you can tie a knot and repeat these steps for the other 2 openings. Next is the most satisfying part, top stitching the tulip top. Once you switch the top stitching and bobbin threads you're using, we'll start at the outer strap edge on the back. With the right side facing up, we'll top stitch 6 mm or 1/4 inch around the edges and seams, sewing in one continuous line until we reach the same spot we began. As you top stitch, make sure your edges are slightly rolled towards the back so the lining doesn't show when you wear the tulip top. As you top stitch, make sure you pivot at the corners and keep the seams laying flat. I've sped up the top stitching so you can see how it all connects in one stitch line. It's so satisfying. Once we finish top stitching, we're officially done sewing the tulip top. Next, we'll be adding grommets to the sides. To start, we'll mark the top corner of one side, 13 mm or 1/2 inch from the side edge. This will be where the top grommet is placed. Next, we'll measure down from the corner and mark the rest of the grommets. The distance between the marks and the number needed depends on the size you're making. You can reference page 28 in the written instructions to find the measurements and quantity needed for your size. Next, we'll puncture the marks using an awl. I recommend going from the front to the back since the grommets will be inserted in this direction. If your awl is not as wide as needed, you can use a chopstick or something of a similar diameter to make the holes wider without cutting the fabric. Stretching the holes in this way makes for a much sturdier base for the grommets by breaking as few threads as possible. The grommet comes in 2 parts. One part has a raised base and goes on the front, and the other part is a flat washer and goes in the back. First, we'll insert the top of the grommet from front to back, pushing the threads towards the sides of the opening. When all the threads are moved out of the way, we'll take the washer and place it on top of the base. Then we'll place the front side of the grommet on the grommet tool, making sure the grommet is fitting into the groove of the tool. Next, we'll place the hammering tool on top of the grommet and hammer it in place. Once you've hammered the rest of your grommets on this side, you can use it as a reference to mark the other side. Then, to make sure the sides match up well, you can place the front and back together and use it to reference the rest of the grommet placements. Once we've hammered in all the grommets, we can now go ahead and lace the tulip top. I've gone ahead and burned the ends of my ribbon, and now we'll start by threading the ribbon through the top 2 grommets from the lining side. Next, we'll take the back ribbon and lace it through the front from the lining side. Then we'll take the front ribbon and lace it through the back from the lining side, repeating these steps until the side is fully laced. Once you've laced the other side, your tulip top is now complete. I hope you feel so proud of what you've created. Now to try it on and play with all the ways you can style it and enjoy wearing your make. I love how versatile and adjustable this design is, and I hope you can wear the tulip top for years to come. I'd like to share a huge thank you to all of the fit models and pattern testers who provided so much valuable feedback for both the fit and the instructions. And a huge thank you to you for being here. I'll see you in the next video.